There was a moment, and you remember it exactly, when something inside you went quiet. Not peaceful quiet. The kind of quiet that happens right before your brain decides it's safer not to finish that thought. That's where this starts. There are two versions of you watching this right now. Version 1 felt that moment, looked directly at it, and then spent the next 6 months building a case for why it meant nothing. Version 1 got very good at explaining, very good at context, very good at, I'm probably just being too sensitive. Version 2, and this is the person you're becoming right now, whether you know it or not. Version 2 learns to stop mid-sentence. Learns to notice when the silence inside isn't anxiety, it's information. The difference between these two people isn't intelligence, it isn't strength. It's one thing. Version 2 stopped overriding the signal, and everything that follows comes down to understanding why you were trained to do exactly that, and what it cost you every single time you did. Look, most people never get here, not because they're not smart enough, because getting here means admitting that the confusion wasn't accidental, that the moments where you second-guessed yourself weren't random failures of perception. They were the product of a system that was working exactly as intended, just not for you. So let's talk about the first signal, the one that came before everything else. There's a specific feeling that shows up early in any dynamic where you're being played, and it doesn't feel like alarm. It doesn't arrive as a red flag with dramatic music. It shows up as a very quiet, very subtle sense that something in the conversation doesn't add up. A micro gap between what was said and what you felt underneath it. A moment where someone's words were perfectly reasonable and your nervous system still sent up a flare. And here's what you did with it. Here's what almost everyone does. You named it wrong. You called it anxiety. You called it your issues. You called it reading too much into things. You opened an internal courtroom and you prosecuted your own instinct. And this is the part no one tells you, that mislabeling is not an accident of psychology. It's the outcome of years of social conditioning that taught you empathy means giving people the benefit of the doubt, that your first instinct is probably projection, that good people don't assume the worst, right? So you became very good at assuming the best, even when the evidence in front of you was quietly telling you something else entirely. The neuroscience here is worth understanding because it reframes everything. Your amygdala, the part of your brain responsible for threat detection, processes social cues faster than your conscious mind can follow. It reads micro-expressions, tonal shifts, behavioral inconsistencies, all of it, before your prefrontal cortex even has a chance to construct a narrative. What this means is that the feeling you had, that quiet wrongness, was not irrational. It was data, unprocessed, pre-verbal, but real. The problem wasn't your instinct. The problem was that your rational mind, the part trained to be fair and balanced and not jump to conclusions, immediately moved to override it. Cognitive dissonance kicks in here like a bouncer at a door. When what you feel doesn't match the story you've been given, or the story you need to believe for this relationship, this friendship, this professional dynamic to make sense, your brain doesn't split the difference. It picks a side. And almost every time, it picks the story. Because the story is safer. The story lets you stay. The signal, if you follow it, might require you to leave. And leaving is terrifying when you've already invested yourself in someone. I know that sounds cold. I know you were taught that following your feelings without evidence is paranoia. But there's a difference between paranoia and pattern recognition. And that difference is the entire subject of what we're building here. Because the signal wasn't random, it was consistent. That's the thing you probably remember now, looking back. It wasn't one moment. It was the same feeling, showing up in slightly different clothes, every time a certain dynamic played out. Every time you brought up something that bothered you and somehow ended the conversation, apologizing. Every time a plan changed at the last minute, and you found yourself managing the emotional fallout of being disappointed. Every time your success in some area was met not with warmth, but with a very specific kind of quiet that you didn't know how to name. You felt it every time, and every time you renamed it something more manageable. Here's the truth. The people who are most effective at manipulation are not the ones who hide everything. They're the ones who give you just enough to override the signal. Just enough warmth, just enough reasonableness, just enough moments of genuine connection to make the signal feel like noise. They don't have to be conscious of this. Some of them are. Some of them have simply learned through years of social interaction that if they provide the right amount of closeness at the right moment, the other person will reset. We'll give them another round. And you did. Because you were taught that's what good people do. Drop this in the comments. My gut knew first. Now let's talk about what happens after you feel the signal and override it. Because there's a specific behavior pattern that kicks in next that most people never identify as part of the same dynamic. You start explaining yourself, not to others, to them, to the exact person who caused the feeling you just decided to ignore. And here's what you need to understand about that loop, because it's one of the most revealing things a person can do inside a manipulative dynamic. Explaining yourself to someone who already knows what they did is not communication, it's submission. Think about the last time you found yourself over-explaining your reaction to someone. You weren't confused about your reaction, you were clear. But somehow, you ended up in a 45-minute conversation about whether your reaction was valid, and by the end of it, you were the one who felt like the problem. Why did you keep explaining yourself to someone who already knew what they were doing? Because the explanation loop is not designed to create understanding. It's designed to create exhaustion. Every time you explain your emotional reality to someone who is using your emotional reality against you, you are handing them a more detailed map of how to do it again. Machiavelli once wrote that it is better to be feared than loved. But what he understood beneath that, what most people miss, is the mechanics of information. He understood that the person who reveals more always loses more. Not because vulnerability is weakness in the abstract, but because in a dynamic where the other person is not operating in good faith, your transparency is their intelligence report. Every time you explained exactly what hurt you, exactly what you needed, exactly what would make you feel safe, you were not building intimacy, you were building a manual, and they were reading it. And this is the part no one tells you about the explanation loop. It feels like the right thing to do. It feels like maturity. It feels like doing the work of communication that everyone tells you healthy relationships require. Right. So you kept doing it. You explained more clearly. You used better language. You tried harder to make them understand. And the more you explained, the more material they had. Not to understand you, to manage you. The pattern here is specific and recognizable once you see it. You explain your reaction. They respond not to the reaction, but to the explanation, picking apart the language, questioning your memory of events, introducing a counter-narrative that somehow makes your hurt into evidence of your sensitivity rather than their behavior. And instead of following that signal, the one that just fired again, quieter this time, because you've started to train yourself to suppress it, you explain again, more carefully this time, with more caveats, with more acknowledgement of your own potential errors. And the loop tightens. This is not a communication failure. I know you were told it was. I know there were probably conversations about how you need to express yourself more clearly, be less reactive, learn to regulate your emotions before bringing them to the table. But look at the structure of what was actually happening. Every round of that conversation ended with you managing more of the emotional weight and them managing less. Every round ended with you having given more and received less clarity, less accountability, less actual resolution. That is not miscommunication. That is a system working exactly as designed. The loyalty trap is where this gets harder, because everything I've described so far becomes exponentially more effective when it's delivered by someone you love or have loved. And here's what the loyalty trap actually does. It doesn't just make you more likely to ignore the signal. It makes ignoring the signal feel like a virtue. It reframes your instinct for self-protection as betrayal, as disloyalty, as giving up on someone who needs you. The closer someone is to you, the more powerful this reframe becomes. Because leaving or even questioning someone you're deeply attached to doesn't just feel like a relational loss, it feels like a moral failure, like you didn't try hard enough, like you abandoned someone at a critical moment. Trauma bonding is not a dramatic concept reserved for extreme situations. It happens in degrees, in ordinary relationships, in friendships, in professional dynamics. Anytime cycles of tension and relief train your nervous system to associate closeness with relief and distance with threat. You don't choose this response. Your nervous system develops it, and once it's there, the signal that something is wrong stops feeling like a warning. It starts feeling like evidence that you need to try harder, work more, give more, fix more. The very thing that should be protecting you becomes the mechanism of your own entrapment. And this is why the nearest people are the most effective at this, not because they planned it, but because proximity gives them access to the exact architecture of your needs. They know what makes you feel safe. They know what makes you feel guilty. They know, because you told them in the explanation loop, exactly which words will land and which ones will reset you. The intimacy that was supposed to be the foundation of trust became the foundation of leverage. And the tragedy is that most of the time, you didn't see it until it was already fully built. So let me ask you something. When did you start confusing loyalty with self-erasure? When did "I'm not a quitter" become the reason you stayed somewhere that was consuming you? Because there's a version of loyalty that is genuinely one of the most powerful human capacities. And there's a version that is a story you told yourself, so you didn't have to face what the signal was telling you from the very beginning. And if you're still here, if you've been sitting with this, and something in you has gotten quieter and more certain at the same time, then you already know that this isn't the kind of thing you work through once and close. This is a layer, and there are more layers underneath it. That's what we do here every week. Not louder, not more dramatic, just deeper. Hit subscribe if you want to keep going down. Drop this in the comments. Loyalty to truth first. You're sitting across from someone and they say something, nothing dramatic, nothing you could take to court, and for exactly 2 seconds you feel it. A shift in the temperature of the room that no one else would measure. Your eyes move to their face and your face stays completely neutral. And somewhere in the space between those two things, your brain just quietly opened a file it's been building for months, you know. Not completely, not in a way you could articulate. But the knowing is there, solid and uncomfortable, sitting right underneath the version of you that is about to smile and change the subject. And then you change the subject, and the file closes. And you tell yourself it was nothing, because the alternative, that it was something, would require you to do something with it. Pattern recognition is one of the oldest survival mechanisms the human brain has. Before language, before logic. Before you could articulate what was wrong, your brain was already building a case, filing data points, noticing that the third time something happened looked remarkably like the first time. And here's what wishful thinking does to that system. It doesn't shut it down, it reroutes it. Instead of using the pattern to protect yourself, you use it to build hope. You find the exceptions, you catalog the good moments, you construct a counter-narrative that explains why this time will be different, and your brain, which is extraordinarily good at finding evidence for whatever story it's already committed to, will help you do exactly that. This is not stupidity. This is the sunk cost fallacy operating at full power inside an emotional system. The more you've invested, time, energy, identity, the version of yourself that exists inside this relationship or dynamic, the more expensive it becomes to let the pattern mean what it actually means. So the brain does what it always does. When the cost of truth is too high, it negotiates. It says, okay, I see the pattern, but look at this one data point that doesn't fit. And you hold on to that data point like it's a life raft. Because in a way, it is. It's the thing that lets you stay without fully knowing you're choosing to stay, right? And here's where it gets precise, because this is the mechanism that keeps intelligent, perceptive people inside dynamics they would immediately recognize as wrong if they were watching someone else live them. It's not that you couldn't see the pattern. It's that seeing the pattern fully would have required you to also see what you'd already lost. And that grief, the grief of realized time, of energy given to something that was never what you thought it was, is often more unbearable than the dynamic itself. So you postponed the seeing, you gave it one more month, one more conversation, one more chance to be different. Machiavelli once wrote that men deceive themselves so willingly that it is almost impossible to undeceive them. He wasn't being cruel when he wrote that. He was being precise. Because the self-deception isn't random. It follows a structure. It happens in the exact places where truth would cost the most. And the people who are most effective at manipulation understand this intuitively. They don't have to manufacture your blindness. They just have to keep feeding the part of you that wants to believe. Keep giving you just enough to sustain the narrative. And your own pattern recognition, turned against itself, does the rest. And this is the part no one tells you. The moment you start to see the pattern clearly, there's a very specific emotional response that arrives first. And it's not anger, it's shame. A retroactive, devastating shame that says, "How did I not see this sooner?" And that shame is the last trap, because it redirects your attention from what they did to what you failed to notice. It makes the revelation about your perception rather than their behavior. And as long as you're sitting in that shame, you're not sitting in clarity. You're still, in a way, inside the dynamic, still making it about your failure to read the room rather than their deliberate construction of the room to be unreadable. So let me ask you this. What would it mean to look at the pattern not as evidence of your blindness, but as evidence of how sophisticated the system was? Because those are two completely different frames, and only one of them gives you anything useful going forward. Now, the mask. Because at some point, and almost everyone who has been in this kind of dynamic can identify the exact moment it slipped. Not dramatically, not in a way that was immediately legible. But there was a moment where the performance had a gap in it, where the carefully managed presentation of who they wanted you to believe they were didn't quite hold. And you saw something underneath it, just for a second, just enough. Look, these moments don't usually arrive as revelations. They arrive as discomfort, a reaction that was slightly too fast, a comment that was slightly too precise in its cruelty, a silence in response to your good news that lasted 2 beats too long, a moment where something you said that should have landed with warmth produced instead a very brief, very controlled flash of something else, irritation, calculation, absence. You saw it, you filed it. And then, almost immediately, the performance resumed and you told yourself you'd imagined it. Here's the truth about micro-expressions and behavioral tells. They're not dramatic. They're not cinematic. They don't come with a soundtrack. They come as the smallest possible deviations from the expected script. A jaw that tightens slightly when you mention an achievement. Eyes that go flat for half a second before the smile catches up. A question asked about your life that sounds interested, but lands without warmth. The mechanics of curiosity without the actual feeling behind it. Your nervous system caught all of it, in real time, long before your conscious mind had language for any of it. The moment the mask slips is important, not because it gives you proof, though it does, but because of what you do with it. Because most people in that moment make an instinctive decision to protect the other person's image, to smooth it over, to not make it a thing. And that protection, that automatic social grace that says, "I'll pretend I didn't see that," is often the moment where the dynamic locks in, because they saw you see it, and they saw you choose not to name it, and now you both know on some level what the rules of this game are. I know that sounds cold. I know you were taught that giving people grace in their weak moments is what good people do. But there is a difference between grace and silence. Grace says, "I see you struggling, and I'm not going to weaponize it." Silence says, "I see what's actually happening here, and I'm going to pretend I don't." One of those protects a relationship. The other one trains someone in what they can get away with in your presence. And every time you chose silence in that moment, every time you let the mask slip back into place without acknowledgement, you sent a signal of your own. You told them the performance didn't need to be that careful, because you would do the work of not seeing. So what did you tell yourself in that moment? What was the story that arrived in the 2 seconds between seeing and deciding not to see? Because that story, that specific, automatic, internally generated explanation for why what you just witnessed wasn't what it looked like, that story is the architecture of how you stayed. And it's worth knowing exactly what it was built from. There is a specific kind of silence that isn't peaceful. It's the silence of someone who has seen too much to speak and has decided, somewhere below the level of conscious choice, that speaking is more dangerous than staying quiet. And if you've been in a dynamic where you were being played, you know exactly what that silence feels like from the inside, not as cowardice, as survival. Here's what most people never examine: why you kept quiet. Not in the dramatic moments. Most people can identify why they didn't speak up when the stakes were obvious and the cost was clear. But in the ordinary moments, the small ones, the dinner table moment where something was said that landed wrong and you looked at your plate and moved on, the meeting where credit shifted and you watched it happen and said nothing, the conversation where your reality was quietly rewritten and you nodded along because the alternative, naming what was actually happening, felt more destabilizing than accepting the revision. This is not weakness. Look, I need you to hear that clearly before we go further, because if you walk away from this carrying shame about the silence, you've missed the point entirely. The silence was trained into you, systematically, over time, by social systems, family, school, culture, that consistently rewarded accommodation and punished disruption. You learned very early that the person who names the uncomfortable thing in the room doesn't get treated as perceptive. They get treated as difficult, as oversensitive, as the one who can't just let things go. And so you learned to let things go. You got very good at it. And then someone came along who understood, consciously or not, exactly how to use that training against you. Right. Because the silence isn't just absence of speech, it's active protection. When you stay quiet in a dynamic where you're being manipulated, you are, on some level, protecting the system. Protecting the version of the relationship that can only survive if certain things are never said out loud. And here's the dark architecture of that protection. It requires you to continuously override your own perception. Every time you choose silence over naming, you send a message to your own nervous system that what you saw wasn't important enough to defend. Do that enough times, and the signal starts arriving quieter. Not because the situation is less wrong, because you've trained yourself to turn down the volume. Machiavelli once wrote that there is no avoiding war, only postponing it to your own disadvantage. And the silence is exactly that, a postponement. It doesn't resolve the dynamic, it deposits it. Somewhere in the body, somewhere in the pattern of how you move through rooms and relationships, it accumulates. And the cost isn't just relational, it's neurological. Because the chronic suppression of what you know to be true, the ongoing management of the gap between your internal reality and the external performance of everything being fine, is one of the most exhausting things a human nervous system can do. It's not dramatic. It doesn't look like suffering from the outside. It just looks like someone who is tired all the time and doesn't quite know why. And this is the part no one tells you about why you protected someone who was using you, because protecting them was also protecting yourself. From the full weight of what it would mean if you stopped, from the grief of the investment, from the identity restructuring that comes when a relationship you built your sense of self around turns out to have been constructed on a false foundation. The silence wasn't just about them, it was about the version of you that only existed inside that dynamic. And letting the truth be spoken meant letting that version of you go as well. And here's what that costs, not just relationally, not just emotionally, but architecturally. Because every version of yourself that you held together inside that dynamic, every adaptation you made to keep the peace, every silence you chose to protect a system that was never protecting you back, all of it left a structural mark, not on who you are, on how you read rooms now, on what your nervous system does when certain patterns appear, on what you reach for when you feel that first signal arriving. And understanding that mark, not as damage but as data, is exactly where the aftermath begins. Because the aftermath isn't the end of the story, it's the first moment where the story finally becomes yours. Now let's talk about the aftermath. Because there's a specific architecture to how people process the realization that they've been played, and most people never examine it consciously. which means they move through it in the dark, making decisions that feel like recovery but are actually repetition. The first thing that happens usually is a reordering of memory. You go back through the timeline and you see it differently. Moments that felt neutral or even warm at the time now carry a different weight. You see the setup in the compliment. You see the calculation in the kindness. You see the moments where information you gave in vulnerability was stored and later used. And this reordering is important. It's your pattern recognition finally being allowed to do its job without interference. But it comes with a danger, which is the danger of totalizing, of deciding that because the manipulation was real, nothing else was. That every moment of genuine connection was performance. That you were wrong about everything. Here's the truth. That's rarely accurate, and it's also not the point. The point is not to retroactively erase every good moment in order to make the betrayal more legible. The point is to understand the system. Because the most effective manipulation doesn't operate in a vacuum of coldness, it operates inside genuine warmth, real moments, actual connection, and uses those things as the infrastructure of control, which means the good moments were probably real, and they were also probably functional. Both things can be true simultaneously, and sitting with that complexity is harder than collapsing it into a simple story of villain and victim. But it's the only version of the truth that actually gives you something useful going forward. And this is where most people get stuck in the aftermath, in the question of fault. Was it deliberate? Did they know what they were doing? And look, I understand why that question feels urgent, because the answer seems like it should change something about how you feel. If it was deliberate, you can be angry. If it wasn't, maybe you should extend grace. But here's what that question actually does. It keeps you focused on them, on their interior, on the mystery of their motivation. And as long as you're solving that mystery, you're not doing the only work that actually matters, which is understanding the system well enough that you don't walk into it again. Because the aftermath isn't really about them. It never was. The aftermath is about you learning to read the thing you were trained not to read. It's about going back to the first signal, the quiet one, the one you renamed anxiety, and understanding what it actually was, and making a decision, a real one, not a motivational poster decision, but a structural one, about what you do the next time that signal arrives. Which brings us to the last place this goes, and it's not where most people expect. Becoming unplayable is not about becoming hard. It's not about building walls or deciding people can't be trusted or moving through the world with a permanent audit running on everyone you meet. That version of protection is just another kind of imprisonment, traded one cage for another, slightly colder one. Real pattern recognition doesn't make you suspicious. It makes you precise. It makes you the kind of person who can be fully present in a dynamic and also fully aware of it simultaneously, who can extend genuine warmth without it being a liability, who can be open without being transparent in the ways that matter. There's a difference between intimacy and strategic disclosure, and learning that difference is not cynicism, it's survival intelligence. Here's the truth about what changes when you become unplayable. It's not that the players disappear, they don't. The same dynamics, the same patterns, the same architecture of manipulation exists in every social environment you will ever enter. What changes is your relationship to the signal. You stop overriding it. You stop running it through the courtroom of social expectation and emerging with a verdict of probably nothing. You let it mean what it means. You give it the same weight you would give any other form of data. And then you act accordingly, not reactively, not dramatically, but with the quiet precision of someone who has decided that their own perception is worth trusting. And this is the final thing, the one that sits underneath all 8 of these shifts. You were played, at least in part, because you were taught that being a good person meant prioritizing other people's comfort over your own clarity, that naming what you saw was aggression, that protecting yourself was selfishness, that the signal your nervous system sent was less reliable than the story someone else was telling you about reality. And dismantling that belief, really dismantling it, not just intellectually agreeing that it's wrong, but actually living differently inside it, that is the work. Not a single conversation, not a single revelation. A consistent daily practice of choosing your own perception over the social pressure to abandon it. You felt it from the beginning. The question was never whether the signal was real. The question was whether you were allowed to trust it. And the answer, the one that changes everything from here, is yes. You always were. Drop this in the comments. I trust what I know.